questions. We're just going to wait a minute or two for everyone to enter into the space. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the CPT's webinar today, Stories from the Frontline of Wet'suwet'en Resistance. My name is Rochelle Friesen, and I'm the Canada Coordinator with Christian Peacemaker Teams. I'm currently in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We'd love to hear a little bit where you folks are coming from. So if you go down to the bottom where it says chat, you can click on that. And in the chat, if you just want to give a shout out to where you're currently listening from, and if you know the traditional territory that you are on, that would be great so we can acknowledge the land that we are all on. And just a reminder is as we acknowledge the land that we are on, we need to also commit ourselves to moving our acknowledgement beyond and into action and work at decolonizing the land that we are on. Again, I'm very happy that you folks are all here. For those of you who don't know us, Christian Peacemaker Teams, or CPT, is an organization that trains everyday people to work in local peacemaking communities that are confronting situations of lethal conflict, partnering with them to transform violence and oppression. Just before we get started, if you are in Northern Turtle Island or in Canada, today is May 5th, and it's the National Day to recognize, remember, grieve the thousands of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls as a result of colonization. Some of us are wearing red to acknowledge today's date, but I would like us to take a moment of silence just to remember the murdered and missing women and girls, Indigenous women and girls, and all of those women have families, have friends, have loved ones that are grieving over their loss. So let's just take a moment of silence. Thank you. So now we'll enter into the main portion of our webinar. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We can't see or hear you for those of you that are listening in. So if you do have a question, we do want to invite you. We're going to have a time of question and answer at the end. And so if you do have a question, at the bottom where you click your chat button, 2 buttons over is the Q&A button. You can place your question there. Some people might want to place it in the chat. The benefit of the Q&A button is that it saves it longer in the future along with your email address that you're registered for. So if we don't get to your question, we can always answer it via email. And now I'd like to introduce to you our main speaker for tonight's webinar, Jen Wickham. Jen grew up in and around Wet'suwet'en territory, being displaced but returning to the community with a dedication to learning and participating in the governance system since 2006. So welcome, Jen. Thank you so much for joining us today. And so I just want to begin with a question that sort of lays out a bit of the context for folks that might not be familiar. So in January, the province of British Columbia, alongside Coastal GasLink, continued their plans to build a pipeline through the unceded territories of the Wet'suwet'en. And on January 5th, the hereditary chief served an eviction notice to CGL. And so I was wondering if you could just start off by telling us more about what the CGL pipeline is and why the hereditary chiefs oppose it.
Sure. So the Coastal GasLink pipeline is a pipeline owned by TC Energy, formerly TransCanada Energy. And it's a fracked gas pipeline that would carry gas from northeastern British Columbia to the coast near Gidim'ten, which then it would transport by tanker to markets in Asia, which right now is kind of ridiculous because the LNG market is completely crashing and there's an oversurplus. So despite it not being an economically viable pipeline, they are pushing forward through our territory. And the hereditary chiefs have been in opposition to any pipeline coming through our territory. We have held multiple feasts. This isn't the first pipeline that the Wet'suwet'en have opposed. The first big one, I guess, that people might be aware of was the Enbridge pipeline. And that was to carry crude oil from the tar sands to the coast. The next one that was proposed was the Pacific Trails pipeline, which was also a fracked gas pipeline. And now we have Coastal GasLink. There are multiple other pipelines that are proposing to go through our territory, and within the agreements that the First Nations bands have signed, they have agreed to consider an energy corridor. And so we know that if one pipeline goes through, then they would like mitigate all the environmental assessments for the other pipeline to then be approved. And so one of the things that I struggle with is framing it around a pipeline dispute. The hereditary chiefs have never given up their jurisdiction or their rights and title to their territory. And so, you know, when we talk about it as fighting a pipeline or opposing a pipeline, we're really limiting the scope of the struggle, and it really is about the sovereign jurisdiction of the Wet'suwet'en people. The Wet'suwet'en have a really unique legal position. I'm sure, well, I'm not sure if people are aware that British Columbia is largely unceded. And so that means that they have never agreed to hand over title to their territories. And so the Wet'suwet'en have never signed a treaty. We've never sold our territory. We've never agreed to let the quote unquote crown manage our territory. There's never been any agreement whatsoever with the hereditary chiefs, who are the traditional title holders of our lands, to anybody. And so in 1997, there was a Supreme Court decision in Delgamuukw and Gistayaway versus the Queen. And this was a Supreme Court of Canada decision that stated that the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have never given up their title to their territory. The recommendation was that we come to an agreement with the government outside of court. And so the Wet'suwet'en entered treaty discussions. Those discussions ended with no agreement in 2008. And since then, the Wet'suwet'en, I mean, a title case would cost millions of dollars. And so that has never been something that was pursued. So the question of title and the scope of title has never been resolved in our territory. The 1997 decision was very clear that we have never ceded our territory, and so we never gave up. We proved in the courts that we have had consistent occupation and use of our territory. since before contact. And so I think that one of the things that people really are interested in or drawn to, or, you know, why so many people in so many nations across Turtle Island are backing us up in this struggle for our jurisdiction, is because, you know, we have one of the best claims to having our rights and title recognized in North America. And if they can force something as destructive as a fracked gas pipeline through our territory without our consent, then they can do it to absolutely anybody. And that includes settler communities. So did I answer that? I feel like I went off on a little
No, that was really, really great.
tangent there. So the question isn't, I think, about which projects we're opposed to. And I've had this question before from, you know, individuals, is like, well, why are you opposed to the pipeline? And it's not really about the pipeline, it's about our jurisdiction and having that recognized and respected by companies and the government. And I mean, there's been so much work done around like our history as Wet'suwet'en people, and specifically in this area that the pipeline's proposed to go through. You know, there's like multiple books written about the court case. And maybe we can provide a link to the Delgamuukw decision in any information that we send out to folks, so that they have a better understanding of like what that really means. But yeah, there's so much documentation, and anthropologists and missionaries and all of these things, like so much is documented around like how we govern our territory and how we have always governed our territory. And so, yeah, I think that really needs to be brought to the forefront in any conversation, is that it's not about one specific project.
Thank you, Jen. And it's so important to hear that it's not about opposition to the pipeline. It's about land and having sovereignty over land. So what does it mean to assert sovereignty in Wet'suwet'en territory, which is unceded? What does that mean? What does that look like? How is that being done?
Well, traditionally, historically, it would be pretty brutal. We have very strict trespass laws. And so each house chief is responsible for a particular territory. Within the Wet'suwet'en Nation, we have 5 clans, and divided amongst those 5 clans are 13 houses. And so each house chief is responsible for managing that territory. So it would look like managing hunting and trapping and fishing in that territory to make sure that that particular territory can sustain the people of that house into the future. And so I think a lot of that was disrupted with colonization and things like trap lines, like registered trap lines, and patriarchy. So trap lines would be something that is passed down through the father side to sons, typically. And that is completely in contradiction with our Wet'suwet'en governance, which is matrilineal. And so I belong to my mother's house, and my son will belong to my house. And so I have a father clan, and actually my father clan is unceded, and they have a very particular role in my life, but that's not who I follow. So I'm not a member of unceded. They're my father clan, and they have very specific roles in my life. And so I think there's a lot of things that have disrupted the act of jurisdiction in our territory. And there were a lot of things that attempted to disrupt the transmission of that cultural knowledge and that traditional governance system within our communities. For example, the potlatch ban in British Columbia. And it was over 100 years that the potlatches were deemed illegal. So our governance system was punishable by jail in British Columbia. And we know of a lot of other nations that have maintained their traditional governance system in secret. And it was no different here. So people still practiced our bathlats, or our feasting, which is where our decisions were made and ratified. And that is how we came to the decision to ban pipelines within our territory, was within our feast hall system. And so I think that, you know, for a quote unquote country like Canada that says that they respect Indigenous peoples and they want to reconcile this relationship, you know, reconciliation within the definition of reconciliation, it's like, how do these two things work together, right? And so they want to come up with some sort of a plan on how to reconcile their authority with our authority. And we've never recognized their authority. So we still go out to our territory and we still manage the moose populations and the salmon and the beaver. And, you know, like we saw an example of how not managing our beaver population affects the territory in like a very real way this year when the spring runoff happened. There's two parts of the road heading up to Gidim'ten camp that were washed out, right? Because those are places where we would manage the beaver population. And we haven't been able to do that because there's such a heavy RCMP presence out on the territory. Could you imagine what it would look like if we went out with our 22s and harvested a beaver? It wouldn't be very pretty. So I think that the eviction of Coastal GasLink was a very tangible example of the hereditary chiefs exercising their jurisdiction. And it was really interesting when it happened. It was on January 4th, by the way. And it was really interesting because after it happened and after we announced that it happened, it was because it happened on a weekend. I was getting calls on the Monday morning from all of these reporters, like all over so-called Canada. And they were like, well, do you think that they're gonna like abide by it? Like, do you think they're really gonna follow through and like listen to the chiefs and leave the territory? And I was kind of surprised. I was like, well, they already have. Like, it took them a couple hours, but they're gone. Like, and so I think it was really, it was surprising or shocking. I think a lot of people were really in a state of disbelief that our Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs were actually listened to, and that the Coastal GasLink employees like abided by the eviction and actually left the territory. But we weren't surprised at all. I think when Indigenous people act on their sovereignty, it's really powerful, and people follow it because they know that it's the truth.
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could also just give us a bit of context, sort of since COVID-19, a lot of what's been going on has fallen out of the news cycle. which is a shame. So if we could just hear a little bit, both on what the last month or so has looked like on the ground, and also what the current situation is right now.
Hmm. Well, we have taken we've done a lot of planning and taken a lot of precautions to ensure the safety of all the people that are out on the territory. We have a very, very detailed COVID-19 protocols plan, which includes isolation as well as quarantine measures should COVID-19 make its way out to the camps, which is very unlikely at this point. We'll see. Hopefully it will remain that way. So the camps no longer go into any of the local towns. Anyone from camp is basically self-isolating out at camp. They have their supplies brought out to them and whatever they need. We are still seeing upwards of 15 to 20 industry vehicles a day go out past the camps, and as well as their private security. So there's two different private security companies, one's Domcor and one is Forsyth, as well as RCMP. And so those are the CERG, members of the CERG department, which is the Community Industry Response Group. And this is a department of the RCMP that was developed specifically to deal with any resistance to industry, which I think speaks volumes around Canada's intention with Indigenous people and their opposition to any development in their territories. We haven't seen any of the CGL workers, their contractors, or the RCMP practice any social distancing or COVID-19 precautions. I recently read the, what's it called? The health, my brain. Dr. Henry, who is sort of heading up the provincial precautions around COVID-19, recently put out something regarding industry work camps and the precautions that they're supposed to be taking, and the responsibilities of each different level. So there's like a health officer, and then the company, the industry, what precautions they have to take, and then as well as the workers. And we're not seeing them do any of those things. So they talked specifically about transportation of the workers from wherever it is that they're staying to the work site. And we are consistently seeing people coming out in vehicles with more than one person to a vehicle, not wearing any PPEs. So they're not wearing masks. They're definitely within 6 feet of each other. You know, in some vehicles, we see as many as 4 employees per vehicle. The RCMP are 2 people per vehicle. And, you know, these CERG members are coming from all over the province. So they're not the local RCMP. These are specially trained officers that they're flying in. And so, you know, if just one of those people has COVID-19, then he's going to pass it on to his partner that he's driving out with. And then they're going to go back to the hotel and they're going to hang out, and they've been seen at the like local liquor stores. So they're drinking with their buddies, they're hanging out with their buddies, you know, as presumably at the local hotels within Houston and Smithers. And we don't have the medical resources to take care of any extra people. Like, we in the north have had limited resources as it is. Houston, the closest town to where CGL is working, doesn't even have a hospital or a medical clinic. People from Houston have to travel to Smithers. And Smithers has a very limited hospital. A lot of people already travel to Terrace for any of their specialist appointments or any sort of specific care that they need. And so it's really irresponsible for them to be continuing work during a pandemic. And they're not taking the precautions that have been set out by the province. And they seem to not even be having any consequences for that. So I don't know, did that answer the question?
Yeah, it did, thank you. And I was also wondering, this week, the Memorandum of Understanding was signed between hereditary chiefs and the government. And I was wondering if you could just explain a bit, what are the implications of that? What does that mean? Yeah.
As far as things go for us, out at the Gidim'ten checkpoint and the Gidim'ten camps, it doesn't mean anything. So the ministers were very clear, both the provincial and the federal governments were very clear that this, according to them, this project has already been approved, and that any project that is already underway will not be included in this discussion that they're having with the hereditary chiefs. And so the Coastal GasLink pipeline, as far as the provincial and federal government is concerned, is not on the table for discussion. So it's completely separate. The things that we're doing out at the camp and the things that we're doing in opposition to this project won't be discussed as part of the rights and title agreement that the province and the federal government are proposing to make with our hereditary chiefs.
Thank you so much, Jen. We're gonna shift gears a bit and hear from some of our other panelists, but folks, again, feel free to write questions that you might have of Jen in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them after we're done hearing from the other panelists.
Great, thank you so much.
So at the beginning of this year, CPT responded to an invitation from Wet'suwet'en and provided accompaniment, legal observing, and solidarity. Those CPTers are joining us today, and I will be asking each of them to briefly share a bit about their experience and their learnings from Wet'suwet'en resistance. And we're gonna start off with Chuck. Chuck is a reservist with CPT and previously served 4 years on the CPT Indigenous Solidarity team. So Chuck, please share with us about your experience and your learnings from this time with Wet'suwet'en resistance.
Yeah, thanks for inviting this question, and thanks to Jennifer for providing that excellent overview and context to this struggle against CGL pipeline. So my time in Wet'suwet'en territory was, for me, kind of a crash course on the policing of Indigenous land defense movements. Natalie and I had arrived only about a month after the before mentioned eviction notice from the hereditary chiefs. And the time we arrived, the RCMP were maintaining an exclusion zone, which was essentially a roadblock on the Morris West Forest Service Road. We had been invited to act as legal observers to document RCMP interactions, wearing fluorescent colored vests with our title clearly printed on it, pens and notepads in hand. The RCMP had been conducting stop checks, vehicle searches, and restricting access to anyone who didn't have approval from their commanding officers. This was also at the time hereditary chiefs were meeting with the provincial government of British Columbia on what was supposed to be 7 days of negotiation to find a peaceful solution to the dispute. It was only a day after these talks that we dissolved that the RCMP held a press conference in Vancouver announcing they would use a measured approach and minimal force to execute a December 31st injunction from the BC Supreme Court. Large teams of RCMP had assembled in the near town of Houston, and the plows began clearing the forest road, a sign of the impending raids. So over the following 2 days, we would be alerted to the consecutive raids of Camp 39, so camps at the 39 kilometer mark and 44 kilometer mark. At the morning of February 7th, Natalie and I witnessed a convoy of 35 police vehicles, including Paddy Wagon, drive up the road for its raid on Camp 44. Both raids were heavily militarized with RCMP tactical units armed with assault rifles, police dogs, drones, and a helicopter. Our stay in Gidim'ten territory was eventually interrupted on the morning of February 8th when more than 15 RCMP officers raided Camp 27. Natalie and I decided to remain at a distance within view of the camp to document the RCMP interactions, which for most people you should be aware that this is within your legal rights to observe police at a safe distance. In fact, we were immediately arrested along with 9 others that day, and we spent the next 48 hours in jail. As our lawyer, Martin Peters, would later argue, none of us were in actual breach of the injunction. At a court hearing, Mr. Peters, our lawyer, would share with the court about his conversation the previous night at the bar with an out-of-uniform RCMP officer. The RCMP officer had recognized him and approached him and started up a conversation. Mr. Peters asked the officer where this exclusion zone comes from, and the officer responded, "We just made it up." Now, the statement in the courtroom was met with an audible gasp. So, in spite of the scathing media coverage the RCMP had recently received in The Guardian for its raid on the Gidim'ten camp just over a year previous, their behavior had improved little from what we witnessed. This was made vividly clear by video footage captured at Camp 44. Particularly shocking is of a Gidim'ten land defender pleading for his life for an officer to stop pointing his rifle at him. So it became very evident to us that the RCMP is able to act arbitrarily and with impunity where the government has vested interest in pushing through an industrial project, something I think my friend Steve Heinrichs will say more about. So that's my significant learning in a nutshell. I have a link to that video that was caught at the time of the raid of Camp 44 that I'll just put in the chat box, but I do want to offer a trigger warning that it's very disturbing to witness. So I will do that. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Chuck. Please drop it in that chat box. And if later after this webinar, folks want to see that link, you can always send us an email and I'll send it on to you as well. So we'll now turn it over to Natalie. Natalie was with Chuck and is also a reservist who trained in 2017. She was also previously part of the Indigenous People Solidarity Team as the program support coordinator. So Natalie, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. You can watch me. Hi everyone, Natalie. Joining you all from Sealk territory in the Okanagan First Nation. And what we've been asked to reflect on is, our learnings and experience from being in the Wet'suwet'en territory. So I was there in February, and I learned a lot of things, including things I didn't expect to learn, like how to build a smokehouse, and just cool things that people know how to do that, I was like, wow, I'm like learning so many life skills. So, but in terms of the situation, it was really interesting and special for me because I was a student when I first read about the Delgamuukw and Gisteway court case, which Jen referred to in her introduction. And I had read it a couple times in poli-sci and then again in the Indigenous Self-Governance program that I took at UVic. So to be there on the territory and to hear people talk about the land, I was like, oh my God, this is the place. Like, that case had such an impact on me and choices I've made in my life in terms of what I've chosen to study and the work I've chosen to do. So to be there was like one of those really special experiences in my life. Being out at the camp where Chuck and I were, we didn't have cell reception, we didn't have Wi-Fi. So that's important to keep in mind because we were in a bit of a bubble and just really witnessing what was going on the ground. And then when we were arrested and we were in jail for a couple days, we got out, we were in court, and after the court hearing, we had a dinner with supporters and people from the community. And I didn't have my phone still. It was away from me. And I started to hear about people talking about solidarity actions happening across Turtle Island, across the globe. And I was just like, I was really blown away by that, to be honest. I don't personally think I've witnessed anything like that in my lifetime, about so many solidarity actions through, Shut Down Canada. I know CPT was involved in the Tyendinaga blockade. I was following really closely what the youth at the BC government legislature were doing. The Okanagan Nation here where I'm from, they put out a statement, and it was just like people were just lit on fire. And it was such a unique experience to have been so out of the loop about what was going on, and then to suddenly be flooded with the solidarity. And it just struck me how much that solidarity matters. And Jen mentioned it as well in the beginning, like if the government can do this to Wet'suwet'en, they can do it to anyone, because the Wet'suwet'en have such a unique situation. Okay, good job. Go say hi. They're in such a unique position where they have fought and they have gone through the hoops of Canadian government and law to prove their case, and yet the burden and the onus is still on them. They're still fighting. So it's so crazy to me to think about how that can be, how it's so unjust. And so that struck me as well. And then the solidarity, how important it really is. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And if folks have more questions about what CPT was doing across Canada during that time, feel free to send us an email as well. So next we're going to move on to Steve. Steve was part of the second trip to support Wet'suwet'en resistance. Steve is the director of the Indigenous Settler Relations at Mennonite Church Canada and is the current vice chair of CPT Steering Committee. We are very lucky. A lot of board members don't usually get this involved in an organization's work, but Steve is our vice chair. So hi, Steve, and we'd love to hear from you of what you learned while you were at Gidim'ten territory.
Well, thanks so much, Rochelle. And a big thank you to everyone that's joined this conversation. Back on February 8th, I was in Vancouver and glued to my phone watching videos of the RCMP raid on Camp 44. And I was totally beside myself. The violence inflicted by the police, with paramilitary forces on the road and helicopters in the sky and snipers in the bush, it was overwhelming. I couldn't help but weep and curse and cry out to God. The violence was so extreme, and for those with eyes to see, it was immoral and evil. And my guess is that many white Canadians who witnessed it were a lot like me. They too had grown up believing that the RCMP was supposed to serve a neutral and mediating presence for society. But watching those raids, that myth was challenged, if not shattered. The raids showed that the RCMP at bottom served the Crown and its courts, that when called on, they're here to enforce Canada's claims over against Indigenous lands, laws, and peoples. All that was so clear back in February. But fast forward to March, when my friend Emily and I arrived in Wet'suwet'en, one day after the chiefs had finished 3 days of title talks with the Crown. The RCMP presence looked much different. They were there, but they weren't armed to the teeth. They weren't prowling in the bush. They weren't a legion of forces. And at first glance, to unwitting eyes, their presence might have looked fairly innocuous, but the violence had not abated. It had merely shape-shifted. Every day as Emily and I monitored activity on that service road, we would document some 50 to 70 Coastal GasLink employees driving in and out of the territory, accompanied not only by private security, but also by the RCMP. In fact, the RCMP were often chaperoning convoys of CGL vehicles as they trespassed together through these lands. Monitoring that road day after day, I came to a greater awareness as to the colonial violence that the RCMP is caught up in and enabling. Back in February, a journalist and a good friend of mine wrote that the RCMP raids were, quote, a ham-handed move. In other words, a major miscalculation, an excessive use of force. But I think it was much more than that. The raids weren't simply a violent aberration of RCMP practice. The raids were an eruption of the everyday colonial violence that the RCMP is sworn to uphold in its allegiance to the Canadian state. Right now, the RCMP's presence out on the territory, on the Yinta, makes it possible for Coastal GasLink to build that pipeline. This post-raid police presence may look mild. There's only a handful of vehicles and a few officers. And it may come, this was my experience, with warm hellos and smiles. But it is nonetheless violent. It is the ordinary, unremarkable violence that settler colonialism is built on. The RCMP are the muscles behind the Crown's sovereign claim to underlying title. They aren't flexing them at this moment, but they are there, continuously facilitating the corporate state's dispossession of native lands. So I think this is my learning. One of the ongoing challenges for settlers like me is to be a lot more attentive to this ordinary, everyday colonial violence. For sure, we need to step up and stand up and get involved when those eruptions take place, when the RCMP flexes weapons in full repressive force. But we all need to be vigilant and persistently active in these ordinary times, these more usual times, for they are, in a very real sense, no less violent. Rochelle.
Thank you, Steve. We'll now invite Emily to share with us, who was with Steve in Gidim'ten territory. Emily is a grad student and a community organizer. She was an intern with CPT Indigenous People Solidarity Team back in 2012 and has been with CPT as a reservist since the summer of 2019. So Emily, would you please share with us?
Thank you. So I was also on the Wet'suwet'en territory with Steve. And as he mentioned, we were doing a 24-hour log of the activity on the road. One night I was sitting out at the guard shack with a Wet'suwet'en fellow, and I had some really meaningful conversations. So I'm going to share a conversation that I had. On this particular night, there was a really beautiful starry sky that was so incredible. As someone who lives in a big city, I really appreciate and feel awed by those skies, and just wanted to mention that I felt very humbled by the sky that night. So I was asking my new friend at the fire about culturally modified trees, or CMTs. And this is something that his brother had told me a little bit about in the week prior. And his brother had worked in the lumber industry. So these trees get the name CMT from the lumber industry because if a lumber crew comes across one of these trees, they're supposed to mark it off and not cut it or anything in the immediate vicinity of that tree. And then an archaeologist needs to come in and assess the area. And so he spoke about the way that these trees are bent as saplings and retain this curved shape when they grow, or they're cut in a certain way. And this is done by Wet'suwet'en people to mark a trail system, a footpath, or a trapping route. And so my friend at the fire shared with me that, you know, back in the day, they didn't have Google Maps or GPS. And so this was their way of knowing routes between the different clans and different house territories. And it's also a way of sharing stories, and some of the cuts would have specific meanings. And so I asked him kind of earnestly, but why just protect that one tree? Isn't the whole forest sacred? You know, if you know that your ancestors passed in that area, then isn't the entire area sacred? And so he responded by sharing a little bit with me about his own journey. And he said that he had been really disconnected from his ancestors and from his identity as a Wet'suwet'en youth. And he started to learn about these things from Chief Sahel. And when he first saw a culturally modified tree, it was really deeply meaningful to him because this was a way for him to connect with his ancestors. And he reminded me of how this is a struggle for many Indigenous youth, this feeling of disconnection. And so as he was speaking, I noticed that there was a lot of traffic on the road that, you know, that we were logging, and that each time a big logging truck moved by, it was harder for me to hear him speak. And this felt like a really big metaphor for me at that moment, that it's similar to the way that the movement of industry on the territories makes it difficult to connect with knowledge and stories of the land. Like similarly, I was having trouble hearing him as these big logging trucks were passing. And I could, in that moment, really picture the entire territory of the Wet'suwet'en marked with these culturally modified trees, and that even the roadways, like the present gravel roadways, are also following these ancient trails. And I felt really moved in a visceral way, with sorrow and also with rage at the desecration that the CGL pipeline represents. And I want to mention too that even in this preliminary work that CGL is doing to clear the right of way for their pipeline, a sacred trail called the ancient Quis War Trail has already had part of its trail desecrated. And there's CMTs that have been identified along that trail system, as well as it's imagined that there are many bones of ancestors buried there, and yet no archaeological impact assessment, which is the bare minimum that, you know, industry sets itself. Nothing has been done around that. And so I'm going to post in the chat a short video about that. And this is just one more reason why this resistance movement is so vital. And, you know, that the Wet'suwet'en law is not being upheld, and neither is the Canadian environmental and archaeological permit system. So thanks for listening, and I'm going to post that video in the chat.
Thank you so much, Emily. So we're going to move into a time of Q&A. We are going to run out of time. We're not going to get to everybody's questions, but drop them in that Q&A and we will follow up with an email. My colleague Alicia is going to help out by asking a question, and I think it's for Jen.
Hi, Jen. We're getting a lot of people want to know if what the next steps are in the Wet'suwet'en resistance and how folks can participate or show solidarity.
Well, that's confidential. Just kidding. Some of the stuff that's going on right now, and one of the things that I'm really excited about, which I think is maybe ironic because I have a really black thumb. So I cannot even keep a cactus. I kill houseplants. It's really sad. But one of the things that we're doing out on the territory, and I think has been highlighted through the effects of this pandemic, is we want to become really we want to promote self-sustainability. And so one of the things that we're doing out at 44 and out at the other Gidim'ten checkpoint at 27 is building gardens. And so we have some folks that are working on some raised garden beds right now. We already had a few of them at the checkpoint at 44 kilometer, but we are expanding that this year. We have another organization that is building some greenhouses, and we're gonna be working on developing some permaculture gardens out on the territory. We also, we want to start making really solid concrete steps towards being self-sustainable out on the territory. And that is gonna not just assist us in protecting our people during this pandemic, but it's also a step towards our own autonomous sovereignty out on the territory and being able to sustain our people from our lands, because we know that a lot of the impacts of colonization have limited us in our ability to sustain ourselves from solely harvesting from the territory. So, you know, we're still able to access in some of our territories things like berries and medicines, but there's so many limitations and barriers through logging and the mining industry and the cattle industry, and of course now pipelines, proposed pipelines. So many of our territories have been impacted by those things that it's really difficult for someone, particularly a family, to sustain themselves just from harvesting traditional foods. And so things like permaculture gardens, we have a really strong ally that is a certified permaculture designer. And so we're going to be looking at developing more things like that within our territory over the summer. Locally, we had put a call out for people to start seedlings for us because, you know, when people were typically starting their seedlings indoors, there was still snow on the ground for us out on the territory. And I think one of the things that folks can really support us with are things like the webinars and the online actions, because we do want to promote the social distancing and keeping people safe during this time. I think one of the most powerful things that people can do is really having personal conversations. And so I don't believe that we're going to make a huge difference with people that are really pro-industry, really pro-pipeline, but we are going to make a difference with, you know, our family members and our friends that maybe we don't speak so freely around because we know that they hold certain beliefs around colonization or around Indigenous people. And so I wanted to use an example of a conversation I had with a local person. They were local to Houston, which is the closest town to where the work is being done. And he was a logger, or is a logger, and has been his entire life. And we get quite a few of these like local visitors out at the 27-kilometer camp. And, you know, he had come out several times with two other people, and they had all been drinking. And the first time they came out, they were yelling and asking a lot of questions of the people that were at the camp. I wasn't there for the first two times that they came out. But the third time that they showed up, I was. And it was interesting. The first conversation that I had was with the woman that was with them. She was quite intoxicated. To highlight the level of intoxication, she wanted to kiss me. And I'm like, no thanks. I'm not interested. And there's a pandemic, in case you haven't noticed. And so after quite a lengthy conversation with her, they left. And then we were getting ready to leave, and we started driving down the road, and they had come back. And it was the driver that wanted to talk to me at this point. And he was very aggressive and very upset. And when we started talking, I came to understand that he was upset about his access to Wet'suwet'en territory being limited. And so it was very much like a white privilege response to the measures that the Wet'suwet'en were taking to protect their territory. But after about an hour of a conversation on logging road in the dark, he had this light bulb moment where he was like, oh, so you guys are protecting the watershed. And I was like, yes. Because he kept wanting to know what I was fighting against. And I kept telling him, I'm not fighting against anything, I'm fighting for something. And I think that's a really important frame to have when we're having these discussions. Because if we're gonna fight against something, there's an endless list of things that we could fight against. And it's really takes a lot of energy. And this conversation took a lot of energy. It was a lot of emotional labor, but it came down to him understanding what I was fighting for, and that was for the water. And he understood that. And at the end of the conversation, like after an hour, where his other two companions, it took so long that they got bored and started walking back to Houston along this dark logging road. And at the end of it, he said, well, I hope you win. And so, although I don't want to have that conversation multiple times, or actually again ever, I had that conversation because I was somewhat forced to, for my own safety. I was, a woman on a dark logging road with two men and a woman that were very intoxicated and very angry. I think that it's really valuable to have those conversations with people. If you have a family member or a colleague or somebody in your life that is just ignorant, just doesn't have the information, I think those are really, really critical conversations to have, because we're not going to win over the guy that works in the tar sands. We're not going to win over the guy that's feeding his family from working in the fracking fields. Some of those people might be open-minded, but like I have someone in my life that he makes $3,600 a week working in the oil fields. So that is a really strong motivator for him to continue to do that. He's a very open-minded person, but he's not going to quit what he's doing because he's going to retire in 5 years, but I think that this particular person, he works in industry, he works in extractive industry, he's a logger, he's been logging his entire life. He believes that he's an environmentalist because he wants to protect trees. I don't understand how that works, but he was intoxicated. So I think that those kind of conversations are really critical. And for other folks to be having those conversations is a huge benefit. And to take some of the pressure off of, Indigenous people to having to have those conversations, I think is really key.
Thank you so much, Jen. We are going to run out of time. So my apologies for everybody's questions that didn't get answered, but we have been so lucky to have received so much information and so much knowledge. So thank you so much to Steve and Chuck and Emily and Natalie. A special thank you for Jen for sharing with us today. We do want to ask that if you're on this call, please follow Untitled Camp. Alicia is going to drop links into the chat, their website. Please follow them on Facebook. Please look at their website. Please look at the Wet'suwet'en Access Point on Gidim'ten territory, also on Facebook. Sign up to receive the Untitled Camp newsletter. Also, the courts love to harass people, drag out court dates, drain people's funds that are protecting the land. So please donate to the Wet'suwet'en Legal Defense Funds because they need your support. Do you have any final words, Jen, before we sign out?
Yeah, so sort of along the same vein there, we are looking at expanding at the Gidim'ten camp. Our neighbors at the Laksamasu are also looking at expanding their camp at Parrot Lake. And so we have links on our website, which is yintaaccess.com. And a lot of background information if people are interested. Like you mentioned, our Facebook page. We also have a Twitter account and an Instagram account if folks want to follow along. We also have a supply wish list on our website. It's springtime and the bugs are going to get really, really, really bad. So most of our requests are around stuff to do with the bugs. But yeah, I just want to thank everybody for showing up today, and especially to our folks that came out to the territory. I know I'm so busy whenever I go out there. I know that most of you, I didn't really get an opportunity to sit and chat with you, but I just really want to thank you all for taking the time out of your lives to come out and support us on our territory, and for sharing your stories. I think those are really important, and the way you shared them today was really beautiful. And so I just want to say Tabi Masai for sharing your experiences and sharing your time with us. Owetsa.
Thank you. And everyone go forth and have a great evening and a great night. Stay safe.